Well, good morning to the church family. Going to be reading back through Matthew chapter 19 one more time. We'll move on from it next week. Now, when Jesus had finished these sayings, he went away from Galilee and entered the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. And large crowds followed him, and he healed them there. And Pharisees came up to him and tested him by asking, "Is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause?" He answered, "Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? And said, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate." And they said to him, "Well, why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and to send her away?" And he said to them, "Because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery." We see here that the Pharisees were bringing a question to Jesus about how permissible divorce was in the law of Moses. And it was a controversial question back then. Divorce is a controversial topic in the church today. But Jesus cuts through all the confusion by just going back to the beginning. Right back to the very first book in the law of Moses that tells the story of God's creation of mankind. And he grounds the marital ethic of faithful endurance in that original template, what God first intended when God first invented marriage. And as he takes his stand on God's created pattern, God's creation template, if you want to call it, he treats it as something binding and authoritative for human practice. And I really see a very big need right now for God's church to follow Jesus and what Jesus is doing here, and to plant our feet firmly in God's creation norm and believe it to be the truth of things, and to let it critique different cultural trends that we see going on today in the same way Jesus was letting it critique a cultural trend in his day. And so last week we looked at two trends. We looked at the separating of sex from marriage, and we looked at the deconstruction of gender. And I'd like to critique one more trend today, and that is what is falsely called gay marriage. I want you to look closely at verse 5. Therefore a man shall leave his father. Well, actually, let's look at verse 4. That from the beginning made them male and female. And said, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. God's definition of marriage rests on our sexual differentiation. For this reason, because of the way God created two oppositely sexed halves of the human race, for this reason, because of the way God made mankind a male-female counterpart to complement each other. For this reason, because of the way God fashioned Eve from Adam's own flesh so that she was one with him in his humanity and yet different from him in her opposite sexuality. For that reason, they are to come together in marital oneness. Our binary gender differentiation forms the basis for the two becoming one. Gay marriage can never be true marriage. By this template, gay marriage is a sinful representation of the real thing. There is no such thing in God's eyes as gay marriage. And I realize that the highest courts of our land legitimized it a few years ago, but I would like to remind you there is a higher throne that all the thrones of this earth are accountable to. And that throne has not commended to us a pattern for gay marriage. In fact, that throne has nothing good to say about homoerotic conduct anywhere in the Bible. Whenever it comes up in the Bible, it is held to be something that is condemned, something that is never given positive treatment in the Scriptures. Homoerotic conduct contradicts the human body. Gay marriage contradicts the human body. Guys, we are chromosomally and anatomically designed for an opposite sex experience. God has so ordered the body and biology for a sexual counterpart. A man's body is made for a woman's body, and a woman's body is made for a man's body. And homoerotic conduct sins against the very architecture of the human body. You could say that there is moral truth baked into the structural order of the human body. And lesbian sex and gay sex sins against that moral truth by disassociating sexual behavior from the structural order of the human body. And so in that way, it's another form of the same lie that lives in transgendered ideology that we covered last week, is that your body has nothing to do with the real you, right? The divorcing of one's personhood from one's body, as if your body is not at all an essential aspect of your personhood. Your body in no way offers any clue to who you are, how you should live, and what you should do with your body. And so you can take on a sexual identity and engage in sexual practices that offend the very architecture of the human body. And as we said last time, your body is an essential aspect of your personhood. It's not the only aspect of your personhood, but it is part of the real you, is the real body that the real you has. And this is why Jesus went all the way in redeeming the real you by resurrecting his body from the grave, so he could be the power source and pattern for your bodily resurrection from the grave. Gay marriage sins against the architecture of the human body. Gay marriage sins against the gospel picture that God made marriage to be. That God designed the relationship between a husband and his wife to reflect the relationship between God and his people. Ephesians 5 identifies the mystery of marriage as a living illustration of Christ's covenantal oneness with his church. And that is a union with differentiation. That you are not God and God is not you. But marriage on earth tells the story of the divine marriage from heaven, where the husband is acting out the role of the heavenly bridegroom through his sacrificial love and leadership assigned to him by God. And the wife is acting out the role of the church in her submission to his loving headship. And those two parties are not interchangeable parties. When you omit male from marriage and it's just female on female, you have dropped the picture of Christ. When you omit female from marriage and it's just male on male, you have dropped the picture of the church from that illustration. And so gay marriage defiles the gospel illustration that God is seeking to present through marriage. In fact, if marriage is a living metaphor, then you're changing the meaning of the metaphor when you try to have male-on-male marriage or female-on-female marriage. Male-on-male marriage is preaching a different message. It's preaching that Jesus saves Jesus. And female-on-female marriage is preaching a very different message, that the church redeems the church. But it's Jesus who redeems the church, and it's the church who is redeemed by Jesus. And you need oneness with differentiation to get that picture across. And gay marriage defiles that very picture that God intended marriage to be. One of the lies of gay marriage is that marriage is mainly about romantic love. It's just the consummation of romantic attraction. And if that's primarily what marriage is, then yeah, why deny marriage to anyone in any direction it wants to go? Why deny marriage to a person who feels romantic attraction toward an animal? Because there's people that do. If that's all that marriage is about, it's just the consummation of romantic attraction, why deny marriage between a man who feels romantic attraction to a minor and vice versa? But if marriage is primarily about God's covenantal love, then it takes union with differentiation to get that across, because you are not God and God is not you. Thirdly, gay marriage sins against one of God's, and I'm going to sound like an old fuddy-duddy here, but it sins against one of God's primary purposes for marriage, and that is the creation of children. Sex makes babies. Opposite sex makes babies. And by locating sex in marriage, God has located babies in marriage. And gay marriage is deliberately and always sterile from the start. And it's oppositional to the way that children are meant to be given to us in the will of God. The creation pattern shows us the way children are meant to be given to us in the will of God, through a womb covenanted to a man who goes into her and life is conceived. And any children that are raised by gay couples, whether that's through surrogacy arrangements or donor conception or adoption, are children who are deprived of critical things that every child deserves to have. Number one, they are deprived of the full illustration of God's image in the male-female counterpart, and the way our gender differentiation features God's image in a richer way. Number two, they are deprived of dual gender influence in parenting and the way God intended that to be a strength in the nurturing of human life. A man's and a woman's biological differences tend toward different parenting styles that really advantage human development, social formation, emotional formation, cognitive formation, when those parenting styles are cooperating together in marriage. What I'm saying is there's no replacement for Pastor Mom. There's no replacement for Pastor Dad. And if gender differentiation doesn't matter in parenting, then why is fatherlessness one of the biggest predictors of poor outcomes in a child's life? One of the biggest predictors of out-of-wedlock children. One of the biggest predictors of deviancy and delinquency and drug abuse and high school dropout, all that kind of stuff. The evidence is in on that. If gender differentiation doesn't matter in parenting. And thirdly, you're depriving children of just the healthy masculine and feminine role modeling that they can work out of as a template for navigating their own future relationships. Gay couples don't have a right to adopt children. Children have a right to be protected from gay adoption. But we won't do that. And we would rather just take children and paste them into that and make children be deprived of those things to support some kind of twisted romantic arrangement in the lives of these adults, so that it's adult desires ahead of child well-being. Now, I want to switch my tone. I want to be absolutely clear with you about what gay marriage is. But that still leaves us with an unavoidable reality. And I think a reality that deserves to be met with a great deal of compassion in God's church. And that is this reality that in the church and out of the church are plenty of people who experience same-sex desires. Their sexual attraction is out of conformity with their biological design. And so there's a vulnerability there. There's a temptability there. And what do I do with that part of me? Well, I think you'll agree with me that there is nothing unique about wanting what God says is wrong for you. There is nothing unique about being attracted to what God says is bad for you. I mean, what you do with that is no different than what you do with all the other areas where our desires seem to be bent in a sinful direction. You know what I'm talking about? The desires we sometimes feel to choose somebody out with lots of colorful language. The desires to get revenge. The desire to look at pornography. The desire to gloat over somebody else's misfortune. The desire to get drunk. The desire to shade the truth a little bit to make myself look good. Guys, everybody in this room has inherited from Adam an ingrained bent to do and desire what God says is wrong for you. There's nothing unique about having inclinations in your flesh and in your mind that are bent in the wrong direction. Sin broke us. It broke our inner life, it broke our outer life, and it broke our sex life. In fact, one of God's primary purposes for laying down his law and providing his people with a very big body of righteous commandments was so that we could see our own sin-ruined nature. Those commandments gave our sinful nature an opportunity to assert itself against those very commandments in thought and in word and in deed, so that we could see that sin is more than something that we do. Sin is something that lives in me. There's an indwelling principle of evil that resides in me. And one of God's primary purposes in giving people a law was so our sinful nature had something to assert itself against, so that we could be convinced of our need for a relationship with God based not on my ability to produce what is right, but me throwing myself onto God's mercy and onto God's grace. And so bottom line, wanting what God has forbidden is not a clue to how God made you. Wanting what God has forbidden is a clue to how sin has twisted you. I want us to look at Ephesians chapter 4. If we could get a verse up there that I wanted to examine together as we talk about this. He says, "That is not the way you learned Christ, assuming that you heard about him and were taught in him as the truth is in Jesus, to put off your old self, which belongs to your former manner of life and is corrupt through" what kind of desires? Deceitful desires that live in the flesh. That means desires that are lying to you about what is best for you. desires that cannot be trusted to be telling you a true story. These are deceitful forms of temptation that originate from within our own sin-corrupted nature. And guys, that means those desires can never be looked to as a compass for true north. And it's very dangerous to try to define our true selves by those deceitful desires, by inner feelings and attractional instincts of the flesh. They're not, in our fallen nature, they are not a reliable guide to God's purposes for us. And this is one of the great lies of the gay marriage, is it attributes moral authority to those deceitful desires. And says you have a moral imperative to live out those desires, to set those desires free, to source your true self in those desires and act upon those desires. And anything else is just repressive. When they say that, what they're telling you is that true freedom is found in obeying your brokenness. And that's a lie. True freedom is found in Jesus. And for the believer in Jesus, our moral imperative is to be faithful to Jesus and his revealed desires for us. And Jesus understands this. This is his word to us. He understands there's things entrenched in us that rage against what God says is right. And that's why Jesus tells us that in order to follow him and to be his disciple, we have to deny self. Everybody has something in them they're going to have to say no to in order to say an even better yes to Jesus. And what Jesus offers us is a new life and a new identity that is sourced in him and the way he is working in us to renew our humanity after the image of our Creator. So let's talk about one of the damaging lies that's actually been circulated in Christendom. It's a damaging lie that I think shows up in the church. And this is the other side. And this is this expectation that the believer in Jesus can expect all homoerotic desires to go away. You can just faith your way out of those. You can just pray the gay away. And I'm here to tell somebody the gospel does not make you that promise. Jesus does not promise the absence of struggle. The Spirit wars against the flesh, and the flesh wars against the Spirit. Galatians 5, written to Christians, said to be the case of Christians. And you know that from your own experience, don't you? Can we nod our heads? Yeah. So the gospel does not promise to just sort of lift up and out of you all the deceitful desires of the flesh that tempt you in the wrong direction. So what then does the gospel promise you? Let's go to 2 Peter chapter 1. And let's read this and follow the logic. His divine power has granted to us all things that pertain to life and godliness through the knowledge of him who called us to his own glory and excellence, by which he has granted to us his precious and very great promises, so that through them you may become partakers of the divine nature, having escaped from the corruption that is in the world because of sinful desires. So that's what the gospel actually promises you. It promises you that to disempower deceitful desires so that you don't have to be mastered by them. Do you see that? Escaping the corruption that is in the world because of sinful desires. To disempower deceitful desires by establishing a new kind of life in you that can partake of God's nature, where you don't have to be named by your sinful desires. You don't have to be controlled by your sinful desires. You don't have to be owned by your sinful desires. A new life that provide you with grace-empowered ability to do the will of God with your life. To base your choices and to base your identity on something better than the sinful desires of the fallen flesh. The goal for a Christian, this is extremely important to hear, the goal for a Christian who experiences homoerotic desires, or what we would call same-sex attraction, is not to get them to feel opposite sex attraction. That's not the goal. The goal is to get them to see their bodies for what their bodies have become in Jesus, and that is members of Christ, and to present their bodies to God as instruments of righteousness, and to work out of the way that Jesus disempowers those deceitful desires from mastering us. Sin shall not be master over you, for you are not under law, Paul says, but under grace. Romans chapter 6. When we want, and I just feel like the church ought to be a safe place where people can be real about the different deceitful desires that create vulnerabilities and temptabilities in them, and that should not be met with shock or disgust or like, what, you have that, or what, you're one of those, what, I can't believe, like that should never be the way we receive that. We want to be a safe place where people can be authentic about what they're really feeling and struggling with. But we also want to be a safe place by not doing the wrong thing with it and doing what the gay movement does with it, and that's attribute moral authority to deceitful desires and say, that's the master key to knowing the real you, and you have an imperative to live out of those, obey those, and act upon those. But you know what it comes down to? When we want what God says we can't have, that tests our trust, doesn't it? When we want something that feels so right to us, that feels so good for us, it feels so natural for us, and then there's this portion of God's word that says it's destructive to us, that puts our trust in God on trial. I thought it was a really helpful book, if you want to read, is Rachel Gilson's book, Born This Way. And it's a book where she kind of shares her own journey to Jesus out of a lesbian way of life, but she makes a very incisive comment in this book about God's original commandment to Adam and Eve. You shall not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for in the day you eat of it, you shall surely die. And what she says is there's nothing in that commandment that is self-evidently, there's nothing about eating from the tree that's self-evidently bad. Like the apparent rightness of that commandment doesn't feel very apparent. Like there's no real why attached to it. Like, well, why? Is it because there's a deadly toxin in the fruit, and if I eat it, it's going to paralyze my nervous system? Or is there an animal that lives in that tree, and if I go near it, it'll attack me? Or are we saving that fruit for a special occasion for when our first baby is born? Like, there's nothing in that commandment that really helps you see the justification for it. It's just sort of put out there in a don't do it sort of way. And there's a lot of commandments where we can see very quickly on the surface God's justification. I mean, even as a kid, I could see the value of my parents telling me, I don't want you to play ball by that busy road, because I could become roadkill very quickly, and I could see the value of that. But Adam and Eve couldn't necessarily see the apparent reason for why God was saying what he was saying to them. In fact, the fruit probably just looked like all the other fruit. It's not like the fruit had, the poison picture of the skull and the bones crossing on it, it was. And her point is that really puts trust on our trial. When we can't see why God is saying what he's saying to me, then it throws us back onto this. Is God's word good to me? Can I believe that when God is telling me that I can't have what I so desperately want to have, that he's actually being good to me? That God's word is good. God's character is good. Because as God is, so God says. You know, and maybe homoerotic desires aren't your particular struggle, and maybe they are. But there's all kinds of other situations that really put trust on trial. You know, I could think about, one that came to mind is when you have a single Christian lady who has successfully taken a pass on the wrong kinds of relationships. And she has been chaste with her body and honored Christ with her body. And she has held out for a God-fearing kind of person that God would one day bring to her, but it hasn't happened. And now her biological clock is running down. She's in her mid or late 30s. Her window for having children is narrowing, and there's nobody in sight except somebody that she's really hit it off with, except somebody she has a lot of fun with, except somebody where there's a great chemistry of connection with, except somebody that she shares lots of interests with and values with, except there's one problem: he doesn't share her faith. And this looks like it's going to be her last chance before that window of opportunity is over. And there's a portion of God's word that says to her, do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers. Is God good in saying that to her? I believe that in every believer's experience, we're going to go through that at some point when the apparent rightness of God's word to us doesn't seem so apparent, and our trust is on trial. And guys, that's really in the church what gay marriage and homoerotic desires is really getting at that question.